debate with Trump about who is the greatest defender of the white race. Hey, what's up, folks? I'm Lil Guillotine, and you're tuned into another episode of The Chopping Block.
Guillotine and your neck meets beautifully.
The Chopping Block.
Today we're going to be looking at the presidential debate between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden that happened last week. As I mentioned in my live reaction video to the debate, I'm usually not very interested in presidential debates or presidential elections in general. The fact of the matter is that we have next to zero power to make positive social change at the ballot box, and immense power to make change in the streets, from the grassroots, from the bottom up. That, and the fact that political positions, like the office of the president, are created to maintain the status quo and not to spark some drastic change within the very system in which they rule, means that who is sitting in these offices are largely insignificant if radical system rehauling is the goal, which I think it ought to be. This means that a system founded on racism and exploitation of working class poor folks and the earth's natural resources ain't gonna change no matter who is sitting in the White House. However, this election was pretty interesting compared to all of the other elections I have witnessed over my lifetime. The president is a staunch supporter and flagrant instigator of white supremacist terrorists, and has even vowed to launch a possibly violent coup and refuse to give up the office should he not win November's election, which has made me extra interested in this particular election. Arguments about harm reduction and lesser evilism aside. So let's get into it. First off, this debate was mostly a joke when it came to moderation and decor. Both Trump and Biden have track records of being misogynist, macho, manly men, which resulted in an inevitable clash on the debate stage, with Trump responsible for 75% of the interruptions, with 75 of them. On top of that, moderator Chris Wallace of Fox News was a complete joke who let Trump run all over him and was largely inept at putting his foot down and controlling the conversation.
Which was heavily
Mr. President,
you would have been much later, Joe.
Mr. President,
much later.
Let's get into the debate topics. The topics that were brought up by the moderator and the candidates were the following, listed from least interesting to most interesting by my tastes. Why you should vote for me, the economy, taxes, Russia, healthcare, climate change, COVID-19, racism, so-called violent protests, and the coming election coup. Let's start with why vote for me. Starting first with the question of why vote for me, Trump said folks should vote for him because he will build up the military, including the Space Force. He criticized Biden's for screwing up the VA during his vice presidential term, resulting in many deaths. This fits a common thread that spews forth from Trump's mouth over the years, an idea of devout nationalism that appeals to the fascist and fascist-leaning Americans who make up the lion's share of his political base. On this subject, Biden offered a bipartisan appeal to working-class folks, with rhetoric about how the billionaires have gotten wealthier over Trump's term, while everyone else has gotten poorer. He also talked about how violence is up and the country is divided. He shot back at Trump's appeal to military ideology by mentioning that his son served in Iraq and won medals. The economy. Not gonna lie, this is the most uninteresting and frankly unimportant topic due to both parties and both candidates being unabashed proponents of capitalism. They therefore both put forward uninteresting capitalist economic theories on how to operate inside the current oppressive economic system. Yawn. Next, taxes. IMO, another very boring capitalist subject, and wholeheartedly not why I tuned in. The president uses the economic system to his advantage, like all billionaires. Big whoop. Russia. Trump here brings up Hunter Biden getting millions of dollars from Moscow, despite having raked in millions himself from Moscow. Biden responds by acting defensive and barely bringing up the popular conspiracy theory about Trump buying the election in 2016, utilizing the ever-ubiquitous Russian bot theory. If I only had $1 for every time I was accused of being a Russian bot on social media for having political opinions that don't line up with neoliberal ones, am I right? Not exactly sure why Biden doesn't leverage that talking point here. Perhaps it's because he is too senile to remember to bring it up, or perhaps it is because the notion is so repeated in mainstream at this point that he didn't need to. Healthcare. Neither of the candidates bring up anything shocking here. Neither, of course, is for Medicare for all, which is what any decent country that cares about its citizens would have. Trump talks about repealing the Affordable Care Act, and Biden talks about adding a public option to the Affordable Care Act. Climate change. After Chris Wallace skirts around the subject of Trump's climate change denying rhetoric and policies by posing the question in the softest of softball manner, Trump avoids directly answering whether he believes in climate change or not. And he starts talking instead about how poor forest management is what led to the disastrous record wildfires in the West. He says what amounted to climate change isn't real. The fact that the trees have leaves is the only reason the fires were started. The Democrats don't rake the leaves enough. Look at the forest cities in Europe. A ridiculous, dim-witted assertion with the sophistication of a kindergartner at best. Trump also claimed that getting rid of emission standards on vehicles will result in more of the newer, more fuel-efficient vehicles on the road and less gas-guzzling ones due to affordability. He then claimed Biden's environmental plan will cost $100 trillion, that Biden will stop all airplanes from flying and get rid of cows. He also claimed Biden said that the military are stupid bastards. Biden claimed to have a climate plan to achieve net zero energy by 2025 by stopping all new construction of coal and oil-powered energy plants, turning the federal fleet into all-electric vehicles while creating millions of green jobs. He adamantly denied being for the Green New Deal and insisted his plan was to be called the Biden plan, indubitably to distance himself from the progressives and appeal to centrist voters. Biden also talked about starting an international pool of money in order to raise $20 billion to give to Brazil so they would stop chopping down the Amazon, but offered no details on how a handout like that would achieve the stopping of deforestation in Brazil. COVID-19. Here, Trump, having no leg to stand on due to his disastrous response or lack thereof, resorts to bashing Biden about the swine flu and politicizing the science behind social distancing, quarantining on a mass scale, and wearing masks, even mocking Joe Biden for wearing masks at one point. Of course, swine flu is not even a fraction of the problem to humanity that COVID-19 is, so to bring that up is pathetic and embarrassing of a point. Trump goes hard on Democrats for advocating closing the economy to save lives, claiming that the profits of the rich are more important than millions of lives that would be saved if we closed the country down. He brings up alleged increases in drug and alcohol use, depression rates, suicide rates, and divorce rates, allegedly in Democrat-controlled areas in the country, as reasons why shutting down is inhumane, a pathetic attempt at rationalizing his murderous policies around COVID-19, and signaling to the capitalists that he will go to no ends to protect their profits. I think it's also important to point out how the president's Darwinian, only the strongest will survive ideology that underpins his open the country at all costs policies and rhetoric play nicely into the genocidal philosophy that the fascists, Nazis, white supremacists, and pseudo-fascists who make up a strong, if not large part of his base adheres to. Biden largely fails to inspire or garner faith here either, sticking mainly to capitalist-friendly policies that would ensure a relatively stable economy by speaking of opening up schools safely and providing businesses support for operating by making sure there is sufficient personal protective equipment or PPE. He steers well clear of any talk of Medicare for all, a universal basic income, or stipends for remaining home from work, sick pay, or rent forgiveness, but rather sticks safely to neoliberal trickle-down economic-friendly policies. He also fails to critique Trump on his poor performance making testing available from the start of the pandemic, but does bring up the deaths that happened under Trump's tutelage. Trump's mask shaming and lack of making PPE widely available. Racism. On the question of racism, both of these avowed racists fail miserably at convincing anyone they're not racists and resort to attacking one another. Biden, conflating the concept of equity and equality, brings up Charlottesville and Trump's "good people on both sides" quote. He doesn't bring up police brutality or police reform at all, let alone defunding or abolishing the police, as would be appropriate given the current record-breaking movement that has adopted those as mantras. He even says, "I'm totally opposed to defunding the police department." The two candidates here seem to be competing for who is the bigger bootlicker, or in other words, the most pro-cop candidate. Biden claims most cops don't want to see George Floyd killed, paying the movement a disservice, and then uses the ever so commonly misused bad apple metaphor to express devotion to maintaining the violent, repressive, racist police, even though the true metaphor points out how one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. He conflates the decrease in violent crime during his term as vice president with support of the police, even though there is ample evidence that increasing or supporting cops does nothing to decrease violent crime in society. Increasing the social safety net does. Biden says that we need community policing, when in reality, community policing is a tactic employed by the powers that be and the police to usurp power from the community and use it for their interests, not a solution to racism. He claims that we're all Americans and that we can defeat racism, employing the oft-used and always despised language of colorblindness. Biden even has the audacity to claim that he is a member of an oppressed group because he is an Irish Catholic, an argument used by many flavors of white supremacists these days, and gets into a surreal debate with Trump about who is the greatest defender of the white race when they get into a spat about who knows more about the suburbs and will defend the suburbs, which is code for the white race. Biden does mention that there is a systemic injustice in this country and in law enforcement, and correctly brings up the disproportionate impact of COVID on marginalized groups in society, but fails miserably at providing even a hint of any plan for reducing said injustice and carnage. Trump correctly brings up Biden's crime bill as being a major source of state repression on black folks in the country, then goes on to attack racial sensitivity training as being racist against white people and teaching people to hate our country. He brings up law and order and cops over and over and over again, constantly mentioning Democrats as anti-cop. Oh, how I wish that were true. After Biden hypocritically condemns seeking justice with violence and props up peaceful protest, but fails to mention the violence of the police and military as they seek justice, Trump claims that the peaceful protest Biden advocates is burning down towns and killing people. He of course brings up Chicago as an allegory for black crime. He claims that if Democrats were in power, the suburbs would disappear, signaling to fascists and white supremacists that he is, like Biden, also a white supremacist. An overall pathetic and harmful exchange of racist thoughts from two bigots. On violent protest, Biden promises to continue federal repression of the movement for Black lives by saying that the violence should be prosecuted, and claims that riots, chaos, and violence help Trump's cause. Says that's why he sends in the feds, referring to Trump's calling in federal authorities to cities with strong protest movements like Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Portland, Oregon. Biden then mentions that the police can handle it, proving again he is on the side of the police and will sell the movement out. Trump says if you send in the National Guard, it will be over, exhibiting once again his passion for repressive violence as a means to solve his problems. The election day coup. Biden here interestingly joins Trump in advocating for his supporters to become poll watchers, which seems a bit like a drastic, confrontational surveillance tactic that may end up causing more conflict than it solves. He also points out that there is no evidence that there's any fraud associated with mail-in ballots, as Trump claims. Trump here goes on a diatribe, spouting many seemingly made-up or exaggerated instances of alleged mail-in ballot voter fraud. From Manhattan to New Jersey to Virginia and West Virginia, he claims that mail-in ballots are being sold for profit by crooked mail carriers, thrown in waste baskets, in creeks and rivers if they have Trump's name on them, as many as 30 to 40% of them being lost. They're being supplied in excess in Democrat-run areas. He also claims that there can be no peaceful transition if he loses because there has been no transition after he won. Trump says that crooked Hillary and others immediately tried to do a coup after he took office, and that they caught them all on tape doing so, as if trying to legally impeach someone is anything like what Trump is signaling that he will attempt if he loses the election. These points are brought up in a pathetic attempt to rationalize his inevitable coming attempt at a violent coup of the position of president should he lose the election. Wallace then goes on to ask Trump if he would urge his supporters to not rise up in a violent civil war if he loses, to which he replies by making a call for his supporters to show up in droves at polls and do poll watching, knowing his base's propensity to brandish weapons and murder people as a principle of their terroristic white supremacist political ideology. He also makes his now popular statement to the white supremacist hate group, the Proud Boys, to stand back and stand by, a line that he was indubitably waiting for the right moment to interject. Well, that does it for this recap and analysis of the first and maybe last presidential debate of 2020. It was certainly a disaster for both sides and has ominous implications for the few weeks we have left in this catastrophe of a year, 2020. Let me know what you thought was the most surprising, despicable thing that was brought up in this debate in the comments. Do you think Biden won the debate? Do you think Trump won it? Comment below. Make sure to like this video if you thought it was at all useful, and definitely smash that subscribe button for more content like this. Yo, thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.